Tonight, I'm very happy and excited to welcome June Chipp. She is going to tell us about the Fenians and the battle against the Fenians in Fort Erie. June was born in Yorkshire and emigrated to Canada as a child. She's brought up in various small towns in southern Ontario and moved to Fort Erie from Mississauga with her husband Bill in 2009. June immediately became interested in local history and after extensive research published her first book, A Self-Guided History Tour of Greater Fort Erie in 2012. And this presentation today is based on June's second book, Duty and Honor, The Stand Against the Fenians in Fort Erie, which was released in 2015 to coincide with the 150th anniversary of the Fenian invasion. All of June's books are available and can be viewed on her website, forteriehistory.com. Thank you very much for joining us, June. I was very excited when AA found you. I have some Irish ancestors who came to Canada from Ireland as well. So I don't know a ton about Irish history and how they came over here. I've done a little bit of reading about the Irish diaspora, but I'm very excited to learn more from you tonight. So I'm going to ask you to open your presentation and
Yes.
we will set you off on your way.
Okay, it's interesting that you have some Irish background. And it's nice to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you enjoy tonight.
I'm sure I will.
I'm now going to share my screen. So tonight we're talking about the invasion of the Fenians and when they invaded Fort Erie in 1866. And in particular, we're going to talk about this fight at the Fort Erie docks. Now, people in Fort Erie, most of them know about the Battle of Ridgeway with the Fenians. And however, even here in Fort Erie, a lot of them didn't know about this other fight that happened until the 150th anniversary, when it was commemorated, and when they learned a whole lot more about what happened on that time. And we're going to start with something everybody knows about, and that is the American Civil War. And this war raged from 1861 to 1865. And there were certain effects of that war on Canada, because Canada was afraid that it might just spread over and we might get invaded here from the States. So one of the things they did was to set up some new militia units. And two of these units were here, the Welland Canal Field Battery. This was a artillery unit based out of Port Colborne and Port Robinson. And the other one was the Dunnville Naval Brigade. And this one, they were in Dunnville, but they had a tugboat that they worked off, the tugboat W.T. Robb. Now, all these men, both these units were armed with Enfield rifles and Victoria carbines. And here, this is a photo of an Enfield rifle. It was similar to a musket in that it did load at the front at the barrel here. However, the inside is rifled so that the effect of this is that the bullets go straighter and a longer distance. And these guns were also fitted with bayonets. And this is the uniform here of the Dunnville Naval Brigade. Now, there was another important effect of the Civil War, because after the Civil War was over, you had all these men who were well-trained in fighting, and now they were basically unemployed. They didn't have too much to do. So the ones who were Irish, many of them joined this new cause. They were called Fenians. They were Irish Americans, and they were protesting against Great Britain for freedom in Ireland. So they came up with this plan, and their object was they would invade Canada. They would go and seize the Welland Canal, take a hold of Canada, and hold the country for ransom against Great Britain to obtain freedom in Ireland. So they were going to launch an expedition into Canada, and the leader of this expedition was Colonel John O'Neill. And he had been a captain in the Union Army. And here he is in his Union Army uniform. So what they did, the Fenians gathered, and they came from all over the states. They gathered in Buffalo on June the 1st, 1866. And this so-called army, they were set up just like a regular army. They crossed the river and they brought with them their drums and their green flags. This is one of the flags here, this sunburst flag. Now they came from, as I said, all over the place. And these are the units that came over. The 13th Infantry from Tennessee. He was under Colonel John, they were under Colonel John O'Neill himself. And the 17th Infantry from Kentucky under Colonel Owen Starr. These men were wearing blue army jackets from their uniforms. And so they were in these uniforms. A lot of the men weren't actually wearing uniforms per se. And then there was the 18th Infantry from Ohio. They were wearing green shirts. So this group here were actually the only ones who were dressed in green. And we have the 7th Infantry from Buffalo and 2 companies from Indiana. Now the Fenians landed at Bowen Road on the Niagara River. They were armed with Springfield rifles and Bridesburg rifles. And Bridesburg Machine Works was a subcontractor for Springfield out of Pennsylvania. They also had rifled muskets, but their rifles were a little different. They had bright barrels. So this is the barrel, and you can see here, this is bright silver, whereas the British rifles had a dull gray metal there. So if you saw somebody carrying one of these bright rifles, you knew they were a Fenian. And this gun right here, this is on display at Old Fort Erie. This is a rifle that was found here, and it is one of the rifles that was actually used in the fight. We know that because it's identified by the markings here on the lock. And they also brought with them personal revolvers and dirks, which is a kind of knife. So as soon as they landed, Colonel Owen Starr with his 17th Infantry from Kentucky, he went straight to the old fort and hoisted the Irish flag. They sent one group down the First of all, they cut the telegraph lines. This, of course, was to cut off all communication. Then they sent one group down the railway track. This was the Buffalo and Lake Huron Railway. They went down here to Centralia Road and burned the Sour Wine Bridge. And if you go to Centralia Road today, you can see this bridge. It's a little footbridge. Here it is. And if you look at the sides, you see these big cement buttresses. So you can tell from this that this was an old railway bridge. And then the Fenians went into the village of Fort Erie itself. This is what it looked like in 1866. So not a whole lot different from what it looks like today. This is today Niagara Boulevard. It was called Niagara Street then. And here we have these streets are Murray Street and Catherine Street here and Bertie Street. And on this side of the river were all these little businesses here and a couple of shops on this side. Here we have the Niagara Railway dock here. And this is the Niagara and Erie Railway. It goes all the way up there to Niagara. And here we have the ferry dock. And then from this dock, there was a ferry running over to Buffalo, or actually Black Rock. It was running about every half hour. So they gathered here in the village. Now they're hungry and they want breakfast, and they demanded breakfast for 1,000 men. There were actually about that many who crossed the river. So the people in their houses, they thought, well, rather than have our houses ransacked, we'll provide these men with breakfast. So at the principal houses and the hotels, they served them breakfast. And this house here in the photo, this is one of the houses that served breakfast. This is the Stanton House, built by a man called Stanton. It still exists today, and this is how it looks. It's on Battery Street. Now, one thing about this house, they also provided refuge to former Black slaves. So, as you probably know, a lot of Black slaves came over here on the Underground Railroad, and Fort Erie was one of the places that they came to. However, so there were some slaves living in town, but when the Fenians invaded, you can imagine how concerned they would be, because as we saw, some of these men were from the South and they would have Southern accents. They would be very concerned that they might be captured and sent back into slavery, even though, of course, it was outlawed after the Civil War. So they gave them refuge in this house. So then, after breakfast, they went to Frenchman's Creek and made their camp on the new Bigging farm. And here today, this is what it looks like. This is Frenchman's Creek with the little bridge here over the creek. And what do Irishmen like to do when they get together? Well, maybe have a drink or two or three. And that's what they did. So they went to this saloon that just happened to be right there near where they camped. And we know that they did that because it was in the newspaper. The Fenians advanced to Freeberry's dock and took possession of a small saloon. While there, they used up all the provisions and drink on the premises. The New York Times, June 3, 1866. Now, while they were in the camp, this customs officer, Richard Graham, he went and checked out this camp. And he went straight back to Port Colborne and reported, the Fenians are drunk and disorganized and can be gobbled up by 400 good men. And right here, this is a photo of this, an actual photo of Freeberry's saloon there. Now we're going to just pause a minute and take a look at the map and see where all these troops are, because it's very confusing today, and even back then it was confusing. People didn't know where everybody was. So we're going to start with this red line, and this is the British Army. Yes, we're still a colony, and the British Army are there to protect us. So on the night, as soon as the Fenians landed, the call went out all over Upper Canada and Lower Canada for all militia to muster immediately at your stations. And within 48 hours, there were 20,000 Canadian men under arms ready to go to war to fight for their country. Okay, so here we have the actual British Army, and they are in Toronto. They muster Friday night, and they take the train. They take the train through St. Catharines all the way to Chippewa. They get off the train, they march here to Black Creek. Then they turn inland and they march to New Germany. This little place here changed its name to Snyder. It's now part of Stevensville. And they stayed there all day Saturday. It wasn't until Sunday that they came to Fort Erie. That's the dotted line down here. That's the British. Now we'll look at our own volunteers, the militia. So here in Toronto, we have the Queen's Own Rifles. They took the ferry, City of Toronto, and crossed Lake Ontario to Port Dalhousie. There they took the train and they came down the Welland Canal Railway to Port Colborne. And then we have the other volunteers over here in Hamilton. We have the Hamilton Light Infantry. They took a different train farther inland. They came down here, they stopped at Caledonia and York, and they picked up the Caledonia Rifle Company and the York Rifle Company, continued on to Dunnville, and then went over to Port Colborne. And then these forces all joined here together, got on the train. This is the Buffalo and Lake Huron Railway, and they came over here to Ridgeway. At Ridgeway, they got off the train and they marched north on the Ridge Road. Now we'll look at the blue line. This is the naval outfit. So they are here in Dunnville. They get on this little tugboat, the W.T. Robb, go on the lake, Lake Erie, go to Port Colborne, and here they pick up the Welland Canal Field Battery. Then they go, this is the middle of the night of June 1, June 2, middle of the night, and they go by boat along Lake Erie. They come up to the river, Niagara River, and they come up here and land at Fort Erie. Now let's take a look at the Fenians in all of this. So like we said, they met in Buffalo here. They went down to Black Rock. They took the ferry, or not the ferry, they had their own boats arranged, crossed the river here, landed at Boehm Road. When they landed, they came down here to the old fort, raised the Irish flag, came down here to the Sourwine Bridge and burned the bridge. Then they went back to Fort Erie here and had breakfast. Then they went up the river. They made their camp at the New Biggin farm at Frenchman's Creek. And they camped there all afternoon. And in the middle of the night, they broke their camp and they marched up the river to the Town Line Road. And here they went inland. They crossed over here to the Black Creek. Then they took this little trail along the creek. And then they branched out into a tributary, Beaver Creek. They went down that trail. And here, they hopped over here to the Ridge Road, picked up the top end of the Ridge Road, marched down Ridge Road. This is now early Saturday morning, June the 2nd. And here, they clashed with our militia right here. And this is where we had the Battle of the Limestone Ridge, otherwise known as the Battle of Ridgeway. This was on the Ridge Road on the morning of June 2, 1866. This is the Queen's Own Rifles, the Hamilton Light Infantry, the York Rifles, and the Caledonia Rifles versus the Fenians. And our men fought very hard at this battle. However, in the end, the Fenians won. And then they went back to Fort Erie along Garrison Road. Okay, let's just go back now to Port Colborne on Friday night, June the 1st, where we have the Welland Canal Field Battery and the Dunnville Naval Brigade, who boarded the tugboat W.T. Robb. This is a photo of the Robb right here. And they traveled down Lake Erie and arrived in Fort Erie Saturday morning. And when they got to Fort Erie was a deserted village. A stillness, almost like death, prevailed. And this was reported in his memoir by Corporal Stephen Beatty of the Welland Canal Field Battery. And why was it deserted? Because the village residents had fled to Buffalo. Now imagine that. in Buffalo, we have the Fenians leaving Buffalo to attack Fort Erie. And in Fort Erie, we have the residents fleeing to Buffalo to avoid the Fenians. So go figure, only in Fort Erie, but that's because many people who lived here had relatives and friends on both sides of the border. And here, this is the ferry, the W.A. Thompson. It was running all that day across the river to Black Rock. So the tug landed at the Niagara Railway dock right here. And here's the tugboat here. The men got off and they patrolled the shore for 3 miles and they took Fenian prisoners. These were men who had been left behind either as guards or because they were stragglers. And they caught 57 of these men and put them on the boat. And then they landed again at the dock. And here today, you can still see the remains of the dock. This dock itself is no longer here. It was short-lived because it was only there to serve this railway. But if you go to this boat launch today, just near Bertie Street, and look to your left, you will see here, if the water's low enough, which it might be because it's low now, you'll see the remains of these old supports here for that railway. Let's take a look at the commanders here. So here we have Captain Richard King. He's a medical doctor from Port Robinson, and he's the commandant of the Welland Canal Field Battery. Here we have Captain Lachlan McCallum, and he's commander of the Dunnville Naval Brigade. And then we have Lieutenant Walter Tyree Robb from the Dunnville Naval Brigade, and he is the captain of the tugboat. So here the soldiers are, they're standing on the dock, and suddenly this horseman arrives in a panic, and he's shouting, "The Fenians are coming, the Fenians are coming." I was sitting at the door of my house smoking. I saw firearms glittering on the Garrison Road. That was Captain Lewis Palmer, and he's an old veteran of the War of 1812. So remember we said that they had those guns with the bright barrels? So they were glittering on the road. So he warned the captains that these Fenians are coming. And at first, the captains didn't really believe them because the rumor had spread that the British had won that fight in Ridgeway. But then more messengers arrived with the same message. There's 400 or 500 Fenians coming on the Garrison Road, so you'd better get your men back on that boat. So the Fenians, as the Fenians were on their way, the captains, they wanted to launch an assault from the boat in the river. They figured that was the most sensible thing to do. However, they were not in charge here because this man is in charge. This is Lieutenant Colonel John Stoughton Dennis. Now, he had come down with the Queen's Own Rifles, but when he heard that the Fenians were drunk and disorderly over at Frenchman's Creek, he thought he could go and capture those Fenians, and then that would be a prize for him. So he took charge of the boat, decided that he was going to take over that little expedition, and here he is, and he says, "I'm in charge here." And they have an argument, and he stamped his foot, and he ordered the men off the dock to march to the road. So they had no option. They marched to the road, and Captain King said, "It is hard, boys, but we must do our duty." So they form a stand at the corner here. This is Niagara Street and Murray Street. Right here, they form a stand. And they're standing on the street here. And this is what it looks like. This is the scene today, and it's not very different from how it was in 1866. because these buildings on the corner, they are actually either the same building that's been renovated or buildings that are on the same footprint. So this is basically what it was like. So here we have the Dunnville Naval Brigade standing across the road in two files facing south down Niagara Street. And the Welland Battery is standing in files lengthwise along Niagara Street, and they are facing Murray Street. There's a little bit of a rise here. They're facing up Murray Street. So the Fenians advance along Niagara Street, but they're also coming down those other little streets, Murray and Lavinia and St. Catharines, to try and cut off the Canadians. And this is what Corporal Beatty remembered. Do you remember the muzzles of those guns pointed at us by the enemy as he came down the hill? And do you remember the black flag that was fluttering in the air? Yes, I remember that very well. Now there were there were no black flags. However, these green flags, they're coming down the hill and they got the sun behind them. This is looking west. So silhouetted against the sun, those green flags would have looked black. Now, this is the view down Murray Street. This is the Fenians marching down Murray. Our men are standing here along Niagara Street, and there's the river behind them. And Captain McCallum said to the colonel, "Are you going to let the men stand there like Stoughton balls to be shot down?" Now, the men are getting restless, and Captain King drew his revolver and threatened to shoot the first man who runs. And this would be the revolver that he was carrying. This is the service revolver that was issued to captains at that time. And this is a Colt Navy 36. So it has 6 bullets. It's basically a 6-shooter, like the old Western guns. Men fire. Captain McCallum gave the order, but the colonel said, "Not yet, Captain, not yet." He wants to be the only one giving orders here. Meanwhile, the tugboat is watching from the dock. So here's Lieutenant Robb. He's still on the tugboat at the dock, and he's watching, and he sees the Fenians coming from Niagara Street, and he also sees them coming down the hill, trying to outflank the Canadians. And he yells out to the captain, "Old man, they are flanking you." And he yells back, "Yes, I know." Now he had specific orders. These orders came right from the top, from the colonel. And his orders were, save the boat and the prisoners at all costs if things start to go bad. Because the colonel wants these prisoners saved. They're his prize. Now notice, there is no order here, stand by to rescue our men. No, save the prisoners. So he casts off the lines, but he hovered at the dock because he's not going to take off and abandon his captain and his men. Suddenly there's a single shot fired up Niagara Street, up here. And suddenly the men hear Captain McCallum shout, "Where the hell are you going?" And he's yelling at Colonel Dennis, who is seen hiking down Niagara Street on the sidewalk in this direction. He's hiking off, going away. Then there's a second shot fired from the hill. So first shot comes from here. Second shot is coming down this hill here. Then the Fenians fired a volley, and the men fired a volley back, and then they started to retreat in this direction down the road because they know that they're going to be outflanked if they don't get away in this direction. Now already we have 4 casualties. So right here at the stand, 4 men are shot in the leg. We have 2 men here, Fergus Schofield and John Bradley, who are shot in the road, and they managed to struggle to the edge here to the river and roll over into the river, where they are later rescued when they are spotted by a local lady from the town, and people come and pull them out and rescue them. And then John Harbison, another one, he's shot over here on the railway track. And Captain King is also wounded here. Now, some of the men come down here and they fight here right on the ferry dock. And there's a big fight there. So today, if you go down to where that dock was, you can still see the remains of the dock. If the water's low enough, you see these old timbers here. And this was the dock where there was hand-to-hand fighting. Now, what happened to Captain King? He was shot on the street here, and they heard him yelling, "Good God, boys, I am shot." And he falls down and tries to get up, and then he fell again. And one of the men helped him up and took him here to the ferry dock and left him here. Here he has some shelter behind this wood pile here. So the men fight here, close fighting with bayonets. And all the men here are captured by the Fenians until only Captain King remains. He's on the dock, lying down because he's shot in the leg. He fires all the bullets in his revolver, and then he rolled off the dock into the river. Imagine that. It was very dangerous in the river here because there's swift currents and there's even a whirlpool out here. But he managed to grab hold of a pylon under the deck, under the dock, and hang on. But the Fenians saw him and they yelled, "Come out or we'll shoot." So finally, he swims over to the dock and he's pulled out. And he's very badly injured in the leg and is taken to Buffalo for treatment. Now that was the fight at the ferry dock. Some of the men come over here to a building over here, which is an old hotel. And this was converted to the Ontario Bakery. Some of you, if you were here a few years ago, you may remember that building there, the Ontario Bakery. There's a photograph of it here. And this was the old J.W. Lewis house. It's not there anymore. It was torn down a few years ago. So there's a big fight there. And this is what it looked like back in 1866. And the men go into that house. Now this is a painting that I had commissioned. So here all our men are inside the house and they're shooting out the windows. The Fenians surround the house and shoot at them. And in this painting, this is the captain here, and he's just coming up to the old hotel, and he sees this young lieutenant who's just going to go into the hotel, and he shouts at him, "Nemo, for God's sake, keep out of that house or you will all be murdered." But this young lieutenant, he holds firm and he says, "I will hold the house. I may as well be killed there as anywhere else." Second Lieutenant Charles Bruce Nemo, Welland Canal Field Battery. So there's a big shootout here. And this house is just a lathe house, and the bullets actually go right through the walls, right inside. And we have this report here. The shots are fast and furious. The air was thick with plaster dust, so that one's neighbor could scarcely be seen. The enemy stove in the panes of glass on the main floor with butt end of their rifles, the glass making a hideous noise as the floor was struck by them. Corporal Stephen Beatty, Welland Canal Field Battery. The Fenians cry out, "Burn the house down!" And the Canadians fight until they run out of ammunition. Then Lieutenant Angus MacDonald of the Dunnville Naval Brigade pulls out a white pocket handkerchief and surrenders. They have no further options. So they surrender, and the captured men are taken to the old fort. The officers are taken to the doctor's house, which has become headquarters for the Fenian officers. Now, Captain McCallum, he did not get caught. He escaped with 15 men down the river road. He has a close escape, though, because 2 of the Fenians closed in and shot at him at close range, but fortunately they missed, and he was saved by Kaulbach. And Kaulbach, he had been in the Civil War, and he was a real fighter. He spun around and shot one of the Fenians and bayoneted the other one. Then he turned calmly to the captain and said, "It's hot here, Cap." Now, Lieutenant Robb, we said he stayed at the dock. He has been tracking the men all the way down the river in the boat, and he tracks them 3 miles down the river, finally gets a chance to bring the men back onto the tug. And they returned to Port Colborne with 57 prisoners in the hold. Now, what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Dennis? Well, we left him running up Niagara Street. He kept right on going until he got to the house of a friend here. Then he went into this house and he hid in the barn. Then he disguised himself. He shaved off his whiskers, dressed up in workman's clothes, and headed out to join the British camp. So now the Fenians, what are they going to do? Well, they've won the fights, but Colonel O'Neill, he sent a messenger over to Buffalo to find out if there were more reinforcements coming. There were no others coming because the river was being patrolled by the US gunboat, the Michigan. So he decided that they would have to withdraw. So he sent for a boat to come and get his men. He released the Canadian prisoners, and they withdrew from Fort Erie. As soon as they got out in the river, this boat, the gunboat, US gunboat, Michigan, arrested them all and took them back to Buffalo because they were breaking the peace treaty between Great Britain and the States, and the United States did not want to start another war with Great Britain. So they were all arrested, those Fenians. Now, that was Saturday. So here we have the next day, Sunday, June 3. Now we have the arrival of the British troops. They're only a day late after all the fighting's finished. And the first one to arrive was the cavalry under Major George Dennison. And here he is here, and he's a fine-looking young man. He would have looked resplendent in his blue and silver uniform. So the cavalry came riding into town, and all the townspeople are cheering, "Yay, the cavalry's arrived." And they were followed by 3,500 soldiers who occupied Fort Erie for several weeks then to stay there until the Fenian threat was over. So let's just review these Canadian casualties. So we had Captain Richard King was shot in the ankle and lost a leg. John Bradley and Fergus Schofield were both shot in the leg and lost a leg. John Harbison was severely wounded in the thigh, and 2 more men were wounded slightly. And on the Fenian side, we had 9 killed and 14 wounded, 6 of them with bayonets. And then we have this buffalo flag here that suffered a casualty. The canton was shot out here by one of our men. Now, I want to take a look at the medals that were issued. some of you, if you have ancestors who fought that day, you may have even seen these medals. So this one is the 1866 Fort Erie Medal, otherwise known as the Fort Erie Cannon, because it has a cannon on it, on that obverse side. And on the reverse side is the name of the recipient inscribed. This medal was given out by the government. Oh, I just wanted to say also, this cannon medal was given out by the county of Welland. And it was given to the men who fought at Fort Erie, and only the men who fought at Fort Erie. So it is scarcer than the other medals. And here we have the Canada General Service Medal. It was given out over 30 years later. That was when the Canadian government got around to giving out medals. And it was given out to all the men who fought in any of the Fenian raids. So there are more of these around. And it has the Queen there, Queen Victoria, on the front. There was also a ceremonial sword given to Captains King and McCallum by the County of Welland. And they gave land to the wounded men. Now, by this time, all the land around here was all given out. It was given out after the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So the only land left was land in the Great Cranberry Swamp. So the men were given land in the Wainfleet Bog. Also, the village of Fort Erie, they gave a sword to Captain King and a silver bugle to the Welland Battery. And the bugle is inscribed, presented to the Welland Canal Field Battery by the inhabitants of Fort Erie for gallant conduct at that place on 2nd June, 1866. Now, what happens after the fight? Well, Captains King and McCallum, they are furious that their commander took off and deserted them, and they demand investigation. So there was an inquiry, official inquiry held. It was at a hotel in Fort Erie, at the City Hotel in Fort Erie. And guess what? It was a closed session. No press, no audience, no announcements. It was a big secret. And there were 6 charges pressed against the commanding officer, Dennis, including desertion in the face of the enemy. It lasted 2 months, September through November. It was set up like a prosecution and defense, or like a court-martial or a trial. There were 50 witnesses. And at the end of all that, the opinion of the court, which was like the verdict, was that he was cleared on all counts. And that verdict was published. But only that verdict was published and not the proceedings of the inquiry. So all the witness testimony was not allowed to be published. Now, that was 1866. So the next year, 1867, we have Confederation and become the Dominion of Canada. And there were only 4 provinces originally who joined: Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And this flag here, this flag flew in 1867. This is the red ensign. And it has here the Union Jack and the 4 provinces who joined. And this flag flew, this is an actual flag here that flew in Humberstone Town Hall in 1867. There is also a flag like this in Port Colborne. They are in the museums now. So these were the first 2 Canadian flags that ever flew in this country. And we are proud to have them right here in Niagara. Now, what happens next? So there's a debate in Parliament. Now we are a country, have our own Parliament. So in the very first session of the first Parliament in November 1867, Captain McCallum, he was elected MP for Monk District, which included Dunville, Wainfleet, and Pelham. He brought forward a motion to make the Dennis inquiry public. Now, Thomas Street, there was a big debate. All the members of Parliament now debated it. Thomas Street, MP for Welland District, which included Welland, Thurles, Port Colborne, and Fort Erie, spoke strongly in favor of bringing forward the evidence. As representative of that portion of the country in which that unfortunate and disgraceful act took place. Now, George Etienne Cartier, Minister of Militia, he spoke out against releasing the document, saying it referred to personal and private matters, but then admitted that he had not read the papers. And the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, first Prime Minister of Canada, spoke out against publishing the inquiry document, stating there might be a feeling among certain people to have the evidence in this case made public, but they should not allow this feeling to lead them to establish wrong precedents, which would be quoted as authority for all time to come. At the end of the debate, the motion to publish the inquiry was denied. And the Dennis Inquiry papers sat at the Canadian National Archives for 150 years. Let's take a look at the aftermath. It's always fun to see what happened to the people involved. So Captain Lachlan McCallum, he was so annoyed and disgusted with what had happened that he resigned from the Dunville Naval Brigade, and Lieutenant Robb also resigned, so the brigade was disbanded. He continued with his businesses, became an MP and then a senator, and lived to age 80. Captain Richard King, he continued to be a medical doctor all his life. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he died from complications of his wounds at age 68. Lieutenant Walter Tyree Robb died a hero only 2 years later in 1868 while rescuing 2 men who were drowning in a boating upset off Long Point. Gunner Fergus Schofield, who was one of the wounded men, was given the position of lighthouse keeper in Port Maitland. Gunner John Bradley, also a wounded man, was appointed as ferryman over the Welland Canal in Port Colborne. And Lieutenant Colonel John Stoughton Dennis, the commander, he became Surveyor General for Canada and Deputy Minister of the Interior. And he was awarded the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 1882. And that is an award for exemplary service given to one's country. Now, I'm pleased to report that we were able to have a new plaque erected in Fort Erie to commemorate this fight. So in 2021, a plaque was raised by the Niagara Parks Commission and the Birdie Historical Society to honor the volunteer soldiers who fought the Fenians in Fort Erie in the fight at the Fort Erie docks. And here it is, right where it happened at the corner of Niagara Boulevard and Murray Street. And in 2016, I published the book Duty and Honor, which contains a full transcription of the Dennis Inquiry, which was 400 handwritten pages that I transcribed and put in the book. And also, I published Shootout at the J.W. Lewis House. And this little book is the memoir written by Corporal Stephen Beattie of the Welland Canal Field Battery, who was actually the only man actually involved in the fighting. He was in that fight at the Lewis House, and he published his memoir. So both those books are available at Old Fort Erie and the Lakeshore Bookstore in Ridgeway, and also on my website, www.forteriehistory.com. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'd be pleased to answer questions if you have any.
Well, that's
And
such a fascinating presentation. Thank you, June.
shall I stop sharing?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, and back with you.
To your website in the chat in case anybody wants to go have a look at the books that you've got on offer. Do have a few questions here. I'm interested, for one, before we start the questions,
Okay.
in the research process. How I know, I mean, from your background that you became interested when you got to Fort Erie, but what was the process of the researching all of your books? How did you kind of start diving into it?
Okay, well, when I researched my first book, which was I wrote a guidebook of Fort Erie, I did a lot of research on history that had happened here. So I went to the library, and I think I read all the books in their history section on the history here, starting right back with the indigenous people 2,000 years ago. So I had a general idea at that point of a lot of the history that had happened here. And then for this particular book, I had heard the author of another book about the Battle of Ridgeway. Some of you may have heard of Peter Vronsky, and he wrote Ridgeway, the Battle That Made Canada. And when I read that book and found out about this inquiry that had happened, that had never been published, I thought, you know, that really needs to be published. And I discussed it with Peter Vronsky, and I said, you know, why don't we publish this? And he said, okay, let's do that. And then we started, and he said, well, June, you could go ahead and you know, and publish that. And so I did the transcription and published it. So that's where that came from. And then in addition, I, you know, obtained more information, and I obtained documents from various sources, from the actual archives, books and memoirs that had been written by other people who had not witnessed the fights personally, but were involved in them, like that cavalry officer, for instance. He arrived there the next day, and he interviewed everybody involved, and he wrote his little book about that fight. So of course I read that, and other information about it. And so all the information that I got came from primary documents or witness testimony. It was all based on fact. And fortunately today, it's all this information can be obtained, you know, online and by email. You don't have to go anymore, drive to Ottawa and go to the archives. You don't have to do that anymore. You can get all that kind of information from Canada Archives and from museums and universities. They all have a lot of information that you can access.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. We actually have Janice Nickerson coming up next, I think, speaking to what you can get in the digital collections of the local universities in Ontario. So
yeah, the universities have a lot. And they are very helpful. And, you know, anybody can ask them for information. You don't have to be a student to get that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Brock University has a lot. I got a lot from them. Mhm.
Yeah, they have a lovely history site, absolute or section in their
Yeah.
library.
Mhm. Mhm.
I have a question from Lloyd Miller, who says that his ancestor Edward Miller and his family lived at Miller's Creek in 1866 on River Road at Ridge Road. How soon were they warned that the Fenians were coming? And did most of the farmers along River Road gather their belongings and flee inland?
Well, how soon did they know they were coming? Word had got out because people knew that they were gathering in Buffalo. Um, the Irish were coming to Buffalo, and well, they were blending in because there's a large Irish population in Buffalo. So they did kind of blend in to the local population, and they were hiding their guns that they were collecting there. So word got out. People were suspicious. And the other thing was that cavalry officer, he knew because he was watching them closely. He even figured out he knew that they were down in Kentucky gathering men, and he even figured out how long it would take them to march from Kentucky to Fort Erie. And
Wow.
from that, he figured out exactly when they were going to arrive in Fort Erie. So some people knew. What was the other question? Oh, the farmers. That's great, by the way, that you have an ancestor, a Miller ancestor, because the Millers were some of the very first settlers who came in the 1780s to Miller's Creek and settled there. But the farmers along the river, well, there weren't many farms along the river. They probably stayed to look after their farms. But the village folk, some of them did go inland, and some of them, they drove their cattle into the woods or the swamps to keep them safe. And some of them went inland. And as I said, some of them went across the river to Buffalo to take refuge. And some of them just held on, and stayed home.
Right, right. Yeah, and as you would
Yeah.
if you weren't directly involved and weren't sure what was going on, I guess.
Yeah. And, they didn't want to leave their houses, some of them either.
Debbie wants to know what happened to the Fenians after they were arrested. Did they disband? Did they give up on their idea of taking Canada, or were they sent to?
Okay, well, yeah, first of all, they were arrested and they went to court in the States, and they were basically rapped on the knuckles and said, naughty boys, don't do that. However, that wasn't the only invasion. There were other invasions, attempted invasions, yeah, and invasions into Canada. There was one in Lower Canada, there was one in Manitoba. And so they kept us busy for a couple of years until finally they had to disband. O'Neill was actually captured in Manitoba, and so that was the end of their invasions. Yeah. Oh, and the prisoners who were captured by our tugboat, they were tried in Toronto, and some of them were sent to the penitentiary and spent a couple of years in jail.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Marianne, thank you for your presentation. Rosemary says an amazing presentation on a subject I knew very little about. She's going to buy your books.
Great.
Um, Heather asked how you got access to the papers for the trial. I think you kind of answered that already.
It was Peter Vronsky who he actually discovered that document when he did research in Ottawa. He saw the actual document and he shared it with me, and I did get permission from Canadian Archives to publish it because it had been a forbidden document.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
even after all those years, you have to still
you
interest.
do. Yeah.
Kathy says, my ancestors were from around Bertie Thorold in Fort Erie. One ancestor was in the 38th Regiment Dufferin Rifles. I also saw the name Stoughton several times as another relative that has a second has it as a second name. Can you
Okay.
put any light on these points?
Um, well, I'm not sure if there's any connection with the Stoughton name. I don't know if there would be a connection there or not. Um, and what was your first part of your question?
One of her
For
ancestors was in the 38th Regiment Dufferin Rifles.
okay, okay. So they were probably called out. There were men who mustered all over Ontario. I know when I was up in Collingwood in their museum, they have a photograph of men who mustered in Collingwood. So they were all over and they got together and they were all ready to fight. But only those few units who actually got to the front right away were the ones who fought. And then, of course, the others came, they missed the fighting, but there were 3,500 men in Fort Erie. And I don't know who all was in Fort Erie, but they may have been here afterwards, guarding the front. Yeah, you'd have to get information from, the archives on what that particular regiment did and where they fought. Yeah.
Hmm. Heather wants to know, were the Irish immigrants to Canada on the Fenian side?
Sorry, where they went?
I think she's asking if they were I'm assuming that if there was a battle, the Irish would have been on the
Well,
Fenians side.
okay. Oh, I think you're asking then, what about were there Irish Fenians in Canada who fought? Is that the question? Who fought with the Fenians?
I think so.
Yeah, I don't know of any Canadian Irish who actually joined them. No, they were all American, I believe, who fought. If there were any Canadians, they may have gone over to Buffalo and joined up with them, and if they did, and if they were one of the ones who were captured, all those men were accused. Any who were British subjects were accused of treason, and any who were American subjects were accused of breaking the peace treaty. So they were all in serious trouble when they were imprisoned, and just lucky that they weren't executed. Yeah.
And then I have one final question from Ron Thacker, who says that his ancestor George Nelson Hamilton was with the 19th Regiment St. Anne's Company, number 8. Commanding officers were J.G. Curry, Lieutenant McPherson, and Captain J. Upper. Oops, sorry. He served from June 1st to 20th and was active in Niagara and Chippewa. Would he have had any interaction with the Fort Erie skirmishes?
Uh, Probably not the actual fights. Again, he may have been in Fort Erie in the weeks after the skirmishes, after the fights guarding the frontier at that time. And again, you'd have to get the actual war record, of that regiment to see exactly what their war record showed us to where exactly they were involved in fighting and where they were stationed.
And then we just got a couple more. Sorry, they popped up. This is Anne who says, "Thank you, great presentation. I'll be purchasing the book. My great granduncle was in the U.S. Federal Army, stationed at Fort Preble in Maine in 1866. Her research found that President Andrew Johnson ordered troops from that fort to help Canada and the British fight off the Fenians. Can you point her in the direction of where she might find more information about the U.S. assistance?"
Hmm. Yeah, good question, because as far as we know, the US just kind of sat back and waited to see. Some people say they just waited to see who won before they came in. I would think probably from the American archives. You know, they'd have more information on that. Asking the National Archives in Washington, maybe if they have information on that, I would think that would be the best place.
Yeah, that would be a good
Yeah.
idea.
And you know, you can contact those people. I contacted the American Archives to see if they could find a document for me. This was a different topic, but I thought, oh, you know, are they ever going to get back to me? And well, I'm telling you, they got back to me. I mean, if it wasn't within hours, it was in a day or two, and they had the document I wanted and said, here it is. And I was amazed, like, wow, pretty good service.
It's
Yeah,
really fun when you kind of have a
yeah,
question, you just
yeah,
shoot off an email, and all of a sudden you have this much
yeah,
more information.
exactly.
I'm just gonna, I've got two more here and then I'm gonna cut it off.
Okay.
Donna says, I believe there are quite a few men in London, Middlesex, Kent County, and as far as Windsor that also went to fight the Fenians. Does that sound right to you?
It does. As I said, they called up the troops all over Upper Canada. So they called out all the militia all through the whole of Ontario, and a lot of them did muster and they came here. They just came after the fighting was finished, but still served here guarding the front. So yes, very well could be true. Yeah.
And then Glenn says the Fenians camp the night of June 1st was in the concession 8, lots 14 and 15 near the sawmill of Samuel Morningstar per the Tremaine map of 1862. Have there been any comments collected from the residents of that area after the Fenians marched south to Ridgeway? Glenn Morningstar, Samuel Morningstar was his great 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 grandfather.
Okay, I don't know about whether they commented because you know, I haven't lived here all my life. However, I know that we know the location of the where the Fenian camp was at Frenchman's Creek. And I think other people, you know, we tried to go up there. We wanted to go up there and look around there with metal detectors to find see if there's any, you know, old relics there, because we know that they, while they were at their camp, they burned a whole lot of their guns because they had so many they didn't even need them all, and so they they burned some of them, and so and some of them they threw them in they actually dumped them in the creek and in the Niagara River because they had so much ammunition, and I know people have gone looking for that stuff as well, and the person who was living up there, he said no, we don't, none of you people, you can't come and dig around on my land. So that's the comments we're getting in today's world.
Well, that was very, very fascinating. Thank you very much, June, for joining us. I'm going to point out that we'll be at the Welland Library, not June, sorry. Us at the Niagara Peninsula branch. We'll be at the Welland Library tomorrow at the mall. If you want to join us from 2 to 4. We've got a whole bunch of interesting webinars coming up in the next couple of months, including the ones I mentioned, the newspapers.com and Janice Nickerson. There's going to be one on the Niagara River in May, and I hope you will be able to join us for some of those. If you have any questions for June, please, I'm assuming you can reach out to her through her website at forteriehistory.com, and her books are available
Yeah.
there. And this webinar, in case you missed anything, will be posted on our website and in our Facebook group. And it will also be sent out in a future newsletter so you can catch up. So thank
Okay.
you very much, everyone, for joining us. Sorry we went a little over time, but thank you and have a good night. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you again.